Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's story, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. Today, I'm sharing something different. Something raw and real. This is the story of someone who lived behind bars for 5 years. Every detail, every moment, the things nobody talks about. So get comfortable, because this journey is going to open your eyes to a world most of us never see. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Jake was 23 years old, sitting in his apartment, when he heard the loud banging on his door. Before he could even think, 6 officers rushed inside with a warrant. His heart pounded, so hard he thought it might explode right there. They told him he was under arrest for robbery. Jake tried to explain, tried to tell them they had the wrong person, but nobody listened. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold and tight. His neighbors watched from their doorways as officers led him down the stairs. The shame burned hotter than anything he'd ever felt. In that moment, Jake's entire life changed. Everything he knew, everyone he loved, suddenly felt a million miles away. The police car door slammed shut, and he stared out the window, watching his freedom disappear block by block. The police station was nothing like the movies. Bright lights buzzed overhead, making everything feel fake and too real at the same time. Officers moved Jake from room to room like he was just another piece of paperwork. First came the fingerprints. Black ink covered his fingers as they pressed each one onto cards. Then the photos, front view, side view. They took everything from his pockets: wallet, keys, phone, even his shoelaces. An officer explained that shoelaces could be dangerous inside. That's when it really hit Jake. He was going to jail. They gave him an orange jumpsuit that smelled like bleach and old sweat. It was too big in some places, too tight in others. Jake changed in a small room with no privacy, feeling like he was losing pieces of himself with every item of his own clothes he removed. The whole process took 6 hours. 6 hours of waiting, standing, answering questions, and feeling completely powerless. Jake's first cell was temporary, a holding tank where they kept people before court. 12 other men sat on metal benches attached to concrete walls. The room smelled like sweat, fear, and dirty bathrooms. Nobody made eye contact. One guy in the corner rocked back and forth, talking to himself. Another man, probably in his 50s, sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. Jake found a spot on the bench and tried to make himself small. He didn't know the rules yet, didn't know who to avoid or how to act. Hours crawled by. There was no clock, no windows. Time felt broken. Someone asked a guard what time it was, and the guard ignored him completely. Jake learned his first lesson. Your voice doesn't matter much in here. He tried to sleep but couldn't. The metal bench was freezing, and every time he closed his eyes, his brain replayed the arrest over and over. The next morning, they chained Jake's hands and feet to 8 other inmates. They shuffled together into a van with metal seats and no seatbelts. Every bump in the road sent someone crashing into someone else. The courtroom was smaller than Jake expected. His public defender, a tired-looking woman with a coffee stain on her shirt, talked to him for exactly 3 minutes before his case was called. She told him the evidence was strong and suggested he take a plea deal. Jake's head spun. Just yesterday, he was free. Now someone was telling him to plead guilty to something he didn't do. But she explained the alternative: go to trial, risk getting 15 years instead of 5. The math was cruel but simple. Standing before the judge, Jake's voice shook as he said the words that would change everything. Guilty, Your Honor. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in state prison. Just like that, his 20s were gone. 3 days later, Jake was loaded onto a prison bus with 40 other men. The bus had thick metal screens on the windows and smelled like diesel fuel. They drove for 7 hours, stopping at 2 other facilities to pick up more inmates. Nobody talked much. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, their own regrets. Jake watched the landscape change from city to farmland to nothing. The prison was built in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by flat, empty land and tall fences topped with razor wire. When the bus finally stopped, guards shouted orders before anyone could even stand up. Single file. Keep your hands visible. No talking. Jake's legs were stiff from sitting, but he moved as fast as he could. The last thing he wanted was to start off with trouble. The prison loomed ahead, massive concrete buildings surrounded by guard towers. This was going to be his home for the next 5 years. The intake process at prison made the police station look friendly. Guards yelled constantly, treating every inmate like they were dangerous criminals. Maybe some were, but the guards didn't care about differences. Jake stood in line with 50 other new arrivals. They were strip-searched in a large room, told to lift their arms, open their mouths, turn around, squat. There was zero privacy and zero dignity. Some guys looked angry. Others looked broken. Jake just felt numb. After the search, they received their prison uniforms, gray pants and gray shirts with numbers stamped on them. Jake was now inmate 847392. They issued him bedding, a toothbrush, a small bar of soap, and a plastic cup. That was it. Everything he owned in the world fit in his arms. A guard gave them the basic rules: when to wake up, when to eat, when to sleep. Breaking rules meant solitary confinement. Fighting meant at a time. Jake listened carefully and memorized everything. Jake's cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, 2 metal beds bolted to the wall, 1 toilet with no seat, 1 sink. His cellmate was already there, a guy named Marcus who'd been locked up for 3 years. Marcus looked Jake up and down without saying anything at first. The silence felt heavy and dangerous. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Top or bottom bunk?" Jake quickly said bottom, not wanting to cause problems. Marcus nodded and went back to reading a worn paperback book. That first night, Jake lay awake listening to the sounds of prison. Doors slamming, people yelling, someone crying in another cell. The lights never fully went off, just dimmed enough to make everything look gray and shadowy. Marcus eventually offered some advice without looking away from his book. Keep your head down. Don't borrow anything. Don't owe anyone anything. Mind your business. Jake thanked him quietly. These words would become his survival guide. The wake-up alarm blared at 5:30 in the morning. A harsh electronic buzz that made Jake jump out of his skin. Marcus was already up, making his bed with perfect hospital corners. Jake copied him, learning quickly that following the routine mattered. They had 15 minutes to wash up, get dressed, and be ready for count. Guards walked past every cell, counting inmates to make sure nobody had escaped during the night. Jake stood at attention like Marcus did, hands behind his back, eyes forward. After count came breakfast. The cafeteria was massive and loud, filled with hundreds of men moving through lines with plastic trays. Jake grabbed what looked like eggs, toast, and something that might have been oatmeal. It all tasted like cardboard, but he was hungry enough to eat every bite. Marcus sat with a group of guys at a corner table. He didn't invite Jake, so Jake found an empty spot and ate alone, watching everything, learning the invisible rules of prison society. Prison had its own social structure, and Jake needed to figure it out fast. There were the lifers, guys who'd been locked up for decades and ran things from the inside. There were gang members who stuck together and controlled certain areas. There were the young guys trying to prove themselves. And there were people like Jake, just trying to survive. Marcus explained it during their first recreation time in the yard. "See those guys by the weight bench? That's the North Side crew. Don't look at them too long. Those guys playing cards? They're cool, but don't sit down unless you're invited. And that old man walking alone. He killed 3 people. Nobody bothers him." Jake's head spun with information. Every group, every person, every corner of the yard had meaning and rules. One wrong move could get you hurt or worse. He decided his strategy was simple: be invisible. Don't stand out. Don't cause problems. Just exist quietly until his time was up. It sounded easy, but in prison, nothing ever was. Jake made it 2 weeks before his first real problem. He was in line for lunch when someone shoved him from behind. Hard. Jake stumbled forward, nearly dropping his tray. He turned around to see a guy twice his size, covered in tattoos, staring him down. "You took my spot," the guy growled. Jake hadn't known there were assigned spots in line. "I'm sorry," Jake said quickly, stepping aside. But the guy wasn't done. He stepped closer, invading Jake's space, testing him. Everyone in line went quiet. Jake knew this moment mattered. If he fought back, he'd get hurt and probably thrown in solitary. If he did nothing, he'd be marked as weak. He chose option 3. He looked the guy in the eye and said calmly, "I didn't know. Won't happen again." For 5 long seconds, nothing happened. Then the guy smiled, not a friendly smile, but not a violent one either. "Now you know," he said, and walked past Jake to take his place in line. Jake's hands shook as he got his food, but he'd survived his first test. Days in prison blurred together, so Jake learned to create structure. Wake up, count, breakfast, work assignment, lunch, recreation, dinner, count, lockdown. The routine became his anchor in a place designed to break you. Jake's work assignment was in the prison library. It didn't pay much, about 20 cents an hour, but it was better than kitchen duty or laundry. He spent his days shelving books, checking them in and out, and cleaning. The library was quiet, peaceful even. It became his favorite place. During recreation time, Jake started walking laps around the yard. Walking kept him moving, kept him from having to interact too much. Some guys lifted weights. Others played basketball. Jake just walked, counting his steps, thinking about his life before and what it might be like after. At night, he wrote letters to his mom and his younger sister. He never mentioned how scared he was or how hard things were. He wrote about the books he was reading and the weather. He made prison sound boring instead of terrifying because that's what they needed to hear. In the library, Jake met an older inmate named Thomas. Thomas was in his 60s, serving his 20th year for a crime he rarely talked about. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of speaking that seemed impossible for someone who'd been locked up so long. Thomas noticed Jake reading one day and recommended another book. That simple conversation started a friendship. They began talking during library shifts about books, about life, about survival. Thomas became a mentor without either of them saying it out loud. Prison makes you hard or it makes you smart, Thomas told him one afternoon. Hard guys don't last. They burn out, get in fights, add years to their sentence. Smart guys learn patience. They use their time instead of letting it use them. Jake asked Thomas how he stayed sane for 20 years. Thomas smiled sadly. I read. I think. I help people when I can. I became someone better than the person who came in here. That's the only real freedom we have, choosing who we become. Those words stuck with Jake and changed how he saw his situation. Once a week, Jake got 15 minutes on the phone. The calls were expensive. His family had to set up a special account, and they were monitored, recorded. But hearing his mom's voice made everything bearable. His mom always tried to sound cheerful, but Jake could hear the strain. She was working 2 jobs to help put money on his commissary account. His sister had started college, but was struggling without Jake's support. The guilt crushed him. I'm so sorry, Jake said during one call, his voice cracking. This is all my fault. His mom was quiet for a moment, then said firmly, You made a mistake. But you're still my son. You're going to get through this, and we'll be here when you do. Some guys never got phone calls. Their families had given up or moved on. Jake watched them on phone day, sitting alone, and felt grateful even through his pain. Connection to the outside world was oxygen. Without it, you suffocated. He promised himself that when he got out, he'd never take a single conversation with his family for granted again. Commissary Day happened once a week, and it was like Christmas and a marketplace combined. Inmates could buy snacks, hygiene products, stamps, and other small items using money their families sent or money they earned from work. Jake learned that commissary items were currency in prison. A bag of chips could buy you a favor. Instant coffee was worth more than actual money. People traded, bargained, and sometimes fought over these small luxuries. He was careful with his money, buying only essentials, toothpaste, soap, envelopes. But once a month, he'd treat himself to a candy bar. That chocolate tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten in freedom, because it represented a tiny choice in a place where choices didn't exist. Some guys went into debt, buying a commissary they couldn't afford. Jake watched them get pressured, threatened, sometimes beaten when they couldn't pay back what they owed. He remembered Marcus's advice, don't borrow, don't owe. He lived by those words. The commissary was a small window into normalcy, but it was also a reminder of everything they didn't have. 4 months into his sentence, Jake woke up in the middle of the night to Marcus groaning in pain. His cellmate was curled up on his bunk, clutching his stomach, sweating heavily. Jake called for the guard, but it took 20 minutes for anyone to respond. When the guard finally came, he looked annoyed. What's the problem? Marcus could barely speak. Jake explained that something was seriously wrong. They took Marcus to the medical unit, and Jake didn't see him for 3 days. When Marcus finally returned, he looked weak and angry. Appendicitis, he said. Almost burst before they bothered to actually examine me. They don't care if we live or die in here. The experience terrified Jake. Medical care in prison was minimal and slow. If something serious happened, you might not get help in time. He started exercising more, eating better, doing everything he could to stay healthy. Getting sick in prison wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Marcus recovered, but he was different after that. Quieter. More bitter. Jake understood why. Thomas encouraged Jake to sign up for educational programs. The prison offered GED classes, vocational training, and even some college courses through correspondence. Jake had finished high school, but he enrolled in a business class to keep his mind active. The classroom became another refuge. For 2 hours, 3 times a week, Jake could focus on something other than survival. The teacher was a volunteer from outside, a woman named Mrs. Patterson who treated the inmates like students, not criminals. She believed in them, which was rare. Most people had written them off. But Mrs. Patterson assigned homework, gave real grades, and expected excellence. Jake worked harder in her class than he'd worked at anything in his life. Learning gave him purpose. It made the time mean something. Instead of just surviving 5 years, he was building toward something. Other inmates noticed. Some mocked him for trying. Others quietly asked if they could join the class too. Education was power, even in prison. Maybe especially in prison. Jake was walking his usual laps when the fight broke out. 2 guys started arguing near the basketball court, and within seconds, fists were flying. Then someone pulled out a shank, a homemade knife crafted from a sharpened piece of metal. Guards rushed in with batons and pepper spray. Alarms blared. Everyone was ordered to the ground immediately. Jake dropped fast, hands behind his head, face pressed into the dirt. His heart hammered in his chest. The whole prison went on lockdown for 3 days. 23 hours a day in the cell, with only 1 hour out for showers. No recreation. No programs. No phone calls. Jake and Marcus sat in tense silence, the walls feeling closer than ever. When lockdown finally ended, Jake learned that one guy had been stabbed badly and was in the hospital. The other was in solitary confinement, facing additional charges. Both had years added to their sentences over an argument about a basketball game. Jake realized how quickly everything could go wrong. Violence was always just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Jake's first Christmas in prison was the hardest day of his life. The prison tried to make it special. They served slightly better food and allowed extra recreation time, but nothing could hide the reality. He was locked up while his family celebrated without him. He called home that morning. His sister answered, and he could hear people talking and laughing in the background. She tried to sound happy, but they both ended up crying. "I miss you so much," she whispered. Jake couldn't speak. He just listened to her breathe until their time ran out. That night, some guys sang Christmas songs in the common area. Others got into fights because the holidays made their pain unbearable. Jake lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he'd survive 4 more Christmases like this. Thomas told him later, "First holiday is the worst. After that, you learn to separate yourself from the calendar. Days are just days. It's the only way to survive." Jake tried to believe him, but part of his heart stayed broken after that Christmas. By his 2nd year, Jake had earned a quiet respect. He minded his business, kept his word, and helped people in small ways through the library. When someone needed a book or help writing a letter, Jake was there. No judgment. No payment expected. Word spread. Guys started coming to him for advice on legal documents or help reading complex letters from lawyers. Jake wasn't a lawyer, but he could read well and explain things clearly. It felt good to be useful, to have value beyond just surviving. Even the guy who'd confronted him in the lunch line nodded at him now. Not friendship, exactly, but acknowledgement. In prison, that meant something. It meant you'd proven yourself. You weren't prey anymore. Marcus noticed the change. "You found your place," he said one evening. "That's good. Men with purpose do their time easier." Jake realized Marcus was right. He wasn't just counting days anymore. He was building something, reputation, skills, character. Prison was still hell, but he'd found small ways to make it bearable. After serving 3 years, Jake became eligible for parole. The hearing was still 6 months away, but Thomas helped him prepare. The parole board wants to see remorse, growth, and a plan, Thomas explained. They need to believe you won't come back. Jake worked on his statement for months. He wrote about taking responsibility for his crime, even though part of him still felt the conviction was wrong. He wrote about the education he'd received, the skills he'd learned, his family support. He wrote about the person he'd become. Mrs. Patterson agreed to write a letter of recommendation. So did the library supervisor. Jake gathered certificates from every program he'd completed. He wanted the parole board to see that he'd used his time wisely. The preparation gave him hope, but also fear. What if they said no? What if he had to serve the full 5 years, or worse, got denied and had to wait another year for the next hearing? The uncertainty was torture. Thomas reminded him, "Control what you can control. The rest is out of your hands." The parole hearing room was small and cold. 5 board members sat behind a long table, their faces neutral and unreadable. Jake sat alone, his hands folded, trying to keep his voice steady. They asked him about his crime, about his time in prison, about his plans if released. Jake answered every question honestly, looking them in the eye, showing respect but not desperation. He talked about his family, his job prospects, his commitment to staying clean. One board member asked, "Why should we believe you've changed?" Jake took a breath. "Because I had to. Prison either destroys you or teaches you. I chose to learn. I'm not the same person who came in here 3 years ago. I've worked hard to become someone my family can be proud of." The hearing lasted 30 minutes. At the end, they thanked him and said he'd receive their decision in 4 weeks. Jake returned to his cell and waited. Those 4 weeks felt longer than the previous 3 years combined. Marcus told him, "Whatever happens, you did your best. That's all anyone can do." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Jake's hand shook so badly he could barely open it. Marcus watched silently from his bunk, giving Jake space but offering support through his presence. Jake read the first line, "The parole board has decided to grant your request for early release." His legs went weak. He read it again to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Granted. Released. Freedom. He'd be out in 30 days. After 3 years and 4 months, he was going home. Jake sat down hard on his bunk, the letter clutched in his hands, and cried. Not sad tears, releasing tears. All the fear, pain, and pressure of the past 3 years poured out. Marcus reached down from the top bunk and squeezed Jake's shoulder. "Proud of you, man. You earned this." Jake managed to say thank you through his tears. That night, he called his family. His mom screamed with joy, so loud he had to hold the phone away from his ear. His sister kept saying, "You're coming home. You're really coming home." It was the best phone call of Jake's entire life. Jake's last 30 days in prison felt strange. He was excited but also anxious. The outside world had kept moving while he'd been frozen in time. Technology had changed. His friends had moved on. He'd have to rebuild his entire life from nothing. He spent time saying goodbye to the people who'd helped him survive. Thomas gave him a book as a gift, a worn copy of a novel about redemption. "Remember what you learned here," Thomas said. "Not the bad stuff. The strength, the patience, the person you became." Mrs. Patterson told him she expected great things from him. The library supervisor wrote down his contact information and promised to serve as a job reference. Even Marcus, who rarely showed emotion, seemed sad to see Jake go. On his final night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of prison one last time. Tomorrow he'd walk out those gates. Tomorrow, his new life would begin. The thought was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. He was ready. He had to be. Jake woke up at 5:30 for the last time to the sound of that alarm. He went through the morning routine one final time, count, breakfast, back to the cell. But this time it was different. This time he was leaving. At 9 o'clock, a guard called his name. Jake grabbed a small bag of belongings, letters, certificates, the book from Thomas, and walked down the corridor. Other inmates called out encouragement. "Stay out, man. Don't come back. Good luck." The processing took 2 hours. They returned his civilian clothes, which hung loose on his body now. He'd lost weight and gained muscle. He looked different. He was different. They gave him $50, a bus ticket, and opened the final door. Jake stepped outside into the sunlight. Real sunlight, not filtered through bars or fences. His mom and sister were waiting by the parking lot. When they saw him, they ran. The three of them collided in a hug, crying and laughing at the same time. Jake was free. Finally, impossibly, wonderfully free. The first few weeks of freedom were overwhelming. Everything was too loud, too fast, too much. Jake had trouble sleeping without the familiar sounds of prison. He felt anxious in crowds. Simple decisions, what to eat, where to go, felt impossible after years of having every choice made for him. But slowly he adjusted. He found a job at a warehouse through a program that helped former inmates. The work was hard, but honest. He attended required check-ins with his parole officer. He reconnected with his family. He started building a new life, one day at a time. Jake thought about prison every single day. About Marcus, who still had years left. About Thomas, who might never get out. About the person he'd been when he went in, and the person he'd become inside those walls. Prison had taken 3 years of his life, but it had also taught him things he'd never forget. About strength. About patience. About who he really was when everything was stripped away. He'd survived something most people couldn't imagine, and that survival had changed him forever. He was determined to make his second chance count. That's Jake's story. A story of survival, growth, and redemption behind bars. Prison life is harsh, unforgiving, and nothing like what you see on TV. It's a place where every day is a test, and the only way out is through. If this story opened your eyes or made you think differently about life behind bars, hit that like button. And subscribe to the channel for more real, raw stories that matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember, every choice has consequences, and every day of freedom is a gift. Take care. Fade to black. End screen with subscribe button appears.